Good afternoon and welcome. I'm delighted to introduce my forthcoming interview with Luke Doherty, who is the chairman of the Orthodox Conservatives. At the time this interview was conducted, 2 or 3 days ago, Luke is in the very last throes of completing his degree and very kindly gave up 45 minutes of his time to talk with me in relation to his view of the world in relation to social conservatism. In my opinion, an underrated value in the current environment and one that I believe will resonate with many of you. I hope very much you enjoy the interview and thank you very much for joining me. All the best. Hello everyone. The next segment of the show is an interview with Luke Doherty, who is the chairman of the Orthodox Conservatives. Luke, good afternoon.
Hello, Chris. Thank you very much for having me on, and hello, everybody watching at home.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. I do appreciate you giving up your time, particularly as I know you're getting right towards the very end of a lengthy degree. So thank you so much for giving your time so freely. We're actually recording this on the afternoon of Thursday, the 5th of May. Rather than me prattle on, would you like to just give a bit of a flavour to yourself and to the background to the Orthodox Conservatives, and we'll move forward from there?
No, absolutely. Thank you again, Chris. So the Orthodox Conservatives started off life in January 2020, so in the context of almost immediately before lockdown. And so a lot of us have been working remotely and for a long time hadn't met each other in person. It was all working remotely and from home and from our libraries and bedrooms. But really started off, I actually wasn't involved right at the beginning. I came on board a little bit later, particularly in my capacity as chairman. But I came on board because I think we realised within the party and within kind of conservative thought in particular that there was an absence of a voice for social conservatives. And so we started off life as being a think tank and movement, a grassroots movement for social conservatives and made up with young people who were committed to an alternative to the social liberalism and the kind of conservative orthodoxy within the Conservative Party. Now, I predicate all of this by saying that this was kind of before all of the COVID restrictions and all of the last 2 years. So if you kind of cast your mind back to before all of that and all the different things and the assault against liberty, all of the different challenges in which people have had with conservatism, particularly in relation to economics and to the role of the state and other things, that it was to try and, I suppose, to provide an alternative to the neoliberal orthodoxy that people would encounter within the Conservative Party. Now, when I came on board, I was committed to taking that further, but tapping into, I suppose, a common sense conservatism, a blue-collar conservatism, if you like, and coined the phrase that social conservatism is a sensible choice for ordinary people. Why is that? Because in December 2019, the Conservative Party won 80 seats in the general election. There was a whole idea of red wall Tories. And so it was trying to fuse together an understanding of conservatism for people who were culturally conservative, which is certainly most British people today, whether they decide to say that they are or not, with a social conservatism, and to make the intellectual case for social conservatism and to make the intellectual case for an alternative to what we have today. I mean, that 2019 election was won on 3 words: get Brexit done and build back better. And so it seemed very clear to me that there was a lack of intellectual narrative, lack of serious backbone about what it means to be conservative in economic or social respects. And so that's part of the reason why we carry out the work that we do. So just a little bit just about what we do as an organisation. We are sort of operate on a 2-pronged approach. Firstly is as a grassroots movement, because we want to try and activate people to work within the local constituencies and in their local area, and in the same way that people were campaigning for Brexit, sort of 10, 15 years ago on the grassroots level before the parliamentary party and the establishment took any notice. We want to try and garner people, particularly young people, together to fight for conservatism and social conservatism from the ground up. But then also we are a parliamentary lobbying group, so we have a number of parliamentarians John Redwood, Sir John Hayes, and others, some of the Common Sense Group and a number of other people interested in our work, and to lobby them on issues too. And lots of that is then informed by the intellectual work which we're doing. So we have a number of academics writing for us, researching for us, and so that our parliamentary lobbying is informed by the academic research in which our team is taking part in.
That all makes sense. So for those that might think that automatically you are aligned root and branch with the Conservative and Unionist Party, which I think you know causes me some difficulties at the moment because I don't believe it to be either Conservative or Unionist. And let's see how that pans out tomorrow at Stormont. You can really say that you are genuinely, if you like, independent of the party, and therefore, yes, whilst you would look to lobby the party and to influence the debate within the party around sort of ideological direction going forward, you're effectively not a Conservative and Unionist party, for want of a better term, arm or leg.
No, so we're not an unofficial arm of the party in the ways that maybe other sort of youth groups like Blue Beyond or young Conservatives or some other group. I mean, not to disparage them too much, but we don't kind of, have meetings with people within the party and kind of almost toe the line to a greater or lesser extent. Yeah. Certainly I personally very much recognise that the Conservative Party, unfortunately, is probably perhaps the only vehicle in which we can affect real change. But that doesn't mean that it is perfect. It certainly doesn't mean that we would unanimously support the party and wouldn't dare criticise, as some other groups are like. And also we recognise that social conservatism is not just limited to one specific party in one period of time. Indeed. And that it certainly supersedes and transcends party politics, which is quite an important point to make.
It's a great point to make. I think slightly left field, I suppose, but how would you equate the current Prime Minister in terms of his social conservatism? Would you view him as marginally socially conservative? He's certainly not ultra socially conservative, is he?
No, I wouldn't say he's socially conservative at all. Very few of our current very few of our current administration are socially conservative. What's really interesting is that there seems to be a narrow list of things that means that people are socially conservative. Perhaps if you're tough on immigration, even though if it's merely necessary because of the extent of immigrants coming into the country, or if we're tough on law and order because we're having violent protests that endanger people, or if we're tough on Brexit, which is apolitical, and people thought, Jeremy Corbyn was an ardent Brexiteer, even though his own party, or parliamentary party rather, wouldn't have characterised him thus. These things don't make people socially conservative. Social conservatism rather is a belief in institutions working well together. It's belief in the family, in other things that transcend an idea of progress for progress' sake. That believes in the value of tradition, and also recognising that we as a human people have inherited things that are intrinsically good and want to keep hold of them. And as a conservative, it's sort of the clues in the name. We want to conserve these things. Now, equally, our detractors might say, well, okay, that's fine, but you're afraid of change. You don't want to move forward. You don't want to progress at all. Well, no, you have to move forward to conserve what you have already. And change is a good thing, but it must be tempered by a positive view of society. For one, it's not about saying that groups that we dislike or don't agree with, that they're awful and must be condemned violently and all the rest of it. But it's being able to move forward and to do things at an incremental human pace, and not to destroy the whole thing. So let's take marriage, for example. We wouldn't say they want to redefine marriage to destroy the institution, but there are other things that we can do that might change, or other things that we can do that might give greater equality, whatever else. I mean, that's a separate conversation. But for us, our conservatism is not about heavy condemnation of people. It's about saying that what we have as a society is largely good, even though the current party is managing lots of its decline in the last 30 years plus.
Yes.
But that ultimately, as a culture, and the things that we've been passed down for the last thousands upon thousands of years, is inherently good. and we want to pass it on to our children because we owe it to them and have a responsibility to them.
And when you look at something like Roe v. Wade, which potentially, if it is overturned, is going to be a seismic thing, I think, on potentially both sides of the pond. Having looked at the demography of the country and how it's changed since the passing of the Abortion Act in 1968, which, in fairness to you, doesn't just predate you, it predates me as well.
Yes, indeed.
By not quite so many years, though. I look at that singular issue, and then you start throwing in things like gay marriage and well, the initially civil partnerships, gay marriage, and now the whole kind of trans piece. And look, I'm like you, I'm very much live and let live. I don't believe in berating people for their life choices, but equally, I do believe in the sanctity of marriage. I do believe in the sanctity of the family. And you know, from where I sit, I think there is a yearning amongst a reasonable proportion of the population, as you say, not to keep looking backwards, but to look forwards in a different direction. And just because things have liberalized so significantly over the last 50 years, it's not a question of stopping that and unraveling all that, but there is another way. I'd hesitate to say
no, indeed. I mean, I suppose I comment on all of this as someone with a with the historian's training, and the idea that we can't look at the future and certainly can't understand our present without having an understanding and knowledge of the past. And there's that infamous saying, isn't there, that those who don't learn from history are bound to repeat it. So certainly there's that idea of looking at the past and actually trying to take those good things, because this idea that everything that's gone before us is not good and we have to destroy everything because it's old and it's useless and, you know, everything is relative now, you know, that I'm sorry, but it is a nonsense. And so few people want to stand up for the objectivity of the past and looking at the past and trying to, you know, okay, we can take sensible lessons from that, but we can't superimpose our own views and morals and opinions about things which are transitory and which change, and superimpose them onto the past. And we see that in cultural expressions all the time. So the Black Lives Matter episodes, all the stuff about public history, the Colston statues, all that other stuff. Even very recently, I was reading an article today in The Spectator about the royal family being accused of being racist, and all these questions about race and identity, which all really boil down to one of our real social ills, which is postmodernism. And I don't want to sound sort of too intellectual, but they can be reduced to a philosophical understanding. And that postmodernism kind of, you know, a little bit like an octopus, has its tentacles and its fingers in lots of different pies, which again then can be read in a wider social context of cultural Marxism. And some people would decry that as, you know, as the right being, you know, obsessed about this kind of conspiracy. But we see the insidious nature of people realizing that we're not going to have violent revolution and overthrow society today, or tomorrow, or perhaps next week or next year, but we can do it incrementally and by stealth through public institutions, education being one of them. When we look at Ofsted and what's being taught to our children and what's being presented to our children, you know, it's really, really insidious. The bias against Ofsted, I mean, even recently, there was the children's sex show in Bristol. There's been other things about where there was very inappropriate literature in a Catholic school in the Archdiocese of Southwark. You know, there's a whole kind of assault against children. I mean, one only has to look at what happens with China's Mao, that you indoctrinate the children. That's where it begins. Now, some people will say that I'm being, you know, hyperbolic about all of this.
No, you're not.
But as a social conservative, I mean, not to kind of give myself this, you know, inordinate label, but these are the types of things that we're interested in, and that we have to say, actually, this kind of stuff is really serious. It's really damaging to young people who are the future, and it has to stop. And that's why we as an organisation are so committed to these things.
I think, Luke, when you start looking at things like the teaching of critical race theory, which is against the law by Brighton Council, and children as young as 4 in Scotland being told they can self-identify without telling their parents, and potentially being appointed with a state-approved, quote-unquote, guardian. I mean, all of this stuff, to me, this is the identitarian left saying we have not successfully won at the ballot box. So I tell you what, let's do. let's cause chaos by inventing our own language, and we'll call that language wokery. And anyone that falls foul of that, we will pile on and we will cancel, including their own. J.K. Rowling is certainly not of the right. But when you've got the world's most successful author of the 20th century being systematically disowned by the very people she made millionaires of, including some of them who can barely act, that's a major concern for me. And I think this issue of small c social conservatism and the need for it to be articulated and for people to understand that just because the left says X, that doesn't make it so, because they can't win at the ballot box. So what they're trying to do is to win largely through our institutions, whether that be the National Trust or the British Library or all of these places, the statues and the renaming and the constant revisionism. It has to be called out. And the problem is people are too scared now to say what they see, to worry about using the wrong word. And when you've got someone like Trevor Phillips, who, as you know, was the founder for the Commission for Racial Equality, interviewing someone and somebody uses, say, the wrong word, Trevor wouldn't correct them. But if you had the wrong kind, and it's usually white liberals being, using the word, let's say, instead of calling you a man of color, which I think everyone would now recognize is the broadly correct term for today's world. I'm sure it'll change again tomorrow. Last year, BAME was in, this year, BAME is out. You got somebody that actually said you were colored and wasn't using it in a racial context. But you would know the difference. A good interviewer, Trevor, would know the difference. He would let that slide because he would know there was no malice or intent in that. Whereas somebody who is on that woke liberal fringe, who is absolutely committed to gotcha and pylons, that could be the end of somebody's career simply for saying one word in the wrong context to the wrong person.
Absolutely, and this is what's really frustrating and what is very, very symptomatic of liberal pluralism becoming increasingly narrow. So you mentioned just before that very interesting discourse on race and the use of language, about J.K. Rowling being cancelled. Yeah. And that happens all the time. I remember Suzanne Moore, I think only last year, perhaps the year before, being similarly cancelled and I think being sacked by The Guardian. I mean, she's somebody who is no way a conservative. I mean, firmly on the left and firmly an ardent feminist. But because of the trans issue and trying to keep women safe, and I don't particularly want to delve into this too much, but it's funny how these issues become so divisive, become so toxic, that you then can't begin to discuss them. And then that's the really interesting thing, that people don't want and cannot discuss ideas openly and freely. And what you find with the left is what they say is, okay, you can have your view and I can have mine, but your view must be the same as my view. And there's no tolerance, there's no space for disagreement and for coming to middle ground and saying, fine, we agree to disagree. There's no idea of truth. And so when there's this large absence of truth or of objectivity, well, then anything is up for grabs. Even something as ardent and as horrible as something as the Holocaust, for example, becomes applicable and becomes acceptable because there is the idea that there is nothing so abominable and so horrendous and so awful that it can't then be unacceptable objectively. And that is the logic. I mean, people might, will disagree and say how horrendous, how awful for you to say that, but that is the logical conclusion of what happens when there is no truth and when there is no idea that some things are bad and will always be bad and some things are good and will always be good. And that's the situation which we find ourselves in today.
Luke, I find it intriguing that people that, whether they be on the left or the right now, this notion of being a free speech absolutist, and obviously I'm linking this to the proposed acquisition by Musk now of Twitter, which has been, all but rather shouting agreed. Why would one have to put oneself out there as a free speech absolutist? You either believe in free speech or you don't. And to my mind, in the modern parlance, that would be me. I would be that guy. And it's okay for somebody to say hurty words to me. They are words. They're not going to kill me. If I'm physically attacked, that's a different conversation
Yes,
altogether.
no, indeed.
But by shutting down, and this is what the left and the right have done this in past years, but it is a particular problem now with the left. And your point there about it's almost the Henry Ford thing. You can have any color, any car you like, as long as it's black.
Yes,
and so long as it's bought. Yeah, well, that's not market freedom of choice, is it? That's essentially you telling me what car I can have, and then it's got to be a black car. So that's mad, but that's what it was. So that's not a debate, is it? Because that's compelled speech, and that's not free speech, is it?
No, it's certainly not free speech, and actually what it is, it's either the state or perhaps actually, and again, one of the criticisms that I have of our current administration, and particularly of the way that conservative politics, because it has embraced neoliberalism so much that then actually it shifts the responsibility and the managerialism and the authoritarianism away from the state, which to some extent is fine, because a large state that intervenes and the nanny state that intervenes in the freedom of choice and the free lives of individuals is wrong. But where does that power shift? Because it doesn't always return back to the individual. No. And now you can say, and some people, I remember, it's so interesting that some conservatives, who are ardently, perhaps more libertarian or ardently fighting for freedom, but then when all the horrible protests were happening, the BLM protests were happening, they were saying for Priti Patel to read the Riot Act and to come down with heavy condemnation of these people. Well, then will people have the right to protest and have the right to express themselves freely? We might ardently disagree with them, but it's interesting then how there is this tussle. But then where does that power from the state, where is that transferred to? Well, largely we see it transferred to huge corporations. And corporatism is something as equally dangerous and equally as insidious and equally damaging to society and to the fabric of society as is a heavy state and as is authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Because we see large groups like banks, for example, if there's a gay pride event, we'll see all the banks coming out waving their flags, or some other thing of where actually public narrative, large social media institutions, Facebook, Instagram, all of these things, reducing argument, reducing complex ideas into, a 30-second, Instagram story, or reducing into sound bites. And so all of this stuff, not just saying one thing alone, but all of this stuff kind of combined together, and to link back to what we do as an organization, reduces intellectual discourse and any discussion of ideas into sound bites, really small segments that actually reduce people's capacity to think and to engage. Because if your only argument with somebody, or your only articulation of an argument is in, 240 characters on Twitter, or in a brief, instant message exchange with somebody on social media, I'm sorry, but that is not how you really fight out ideas. And so for our organism, what the Orthodox Conservatives try and do to repair, to some greater or lesser extent, all of that damage, is to try and represent sound conservative ideas. So we had a manifesto published at the end of last year, I think in November 2021, a long time ago now, to try and provide some intellectual backbone to conservatism. It's a little bit dense, but if you kind of have that kind of intellectual mind and want to read it, then do. And also we have lots of commentary. So another aspect to our work is to provide commentary on our different areas of interest. So we have you, Chris, write for us on economics and write very good things. Other people will write on foreign policy or on architecture and institutions, on education and other points. And that again is to try and just fill that huge void of where we just don't talk about stuff and don't have anything to say, and don't have anything to defend. And by doing that, we then hope to have something for people to get their teeth stuck into, and then talk about more stuff than Brexit, which in slightly ambiguous terms, or building back better, and again ambiguous terms.
It's interesting that I wanted to just pick up on one thing that you touched on there, is this sort of corporatist, dare I say, globalist theme, which I think there is beginning to be the very beginnings, if I can say that, that's a doubling, but you know where I'm going with it, that very much the conception of an understanding of the so-called New World Order, the World Economic Forum, digital IDs, everyone will be happy, but no one will own anything apart from a cabal of billionaires. And I think it really does plug into a lot of the things we've covered in the first part of this interview, which is around, this is essentially Marxism. by stealth. So it's fascinating that every time you sort of peel back the layers of the World Economic Forum, and by the way, to anyone watching, do read the Orthodox Conservatives manifesto, because it's effectively diametrically opposite to what you'll see from the Davos set. If you go onto the World Economic Forum website, all you'll see is, frankly, a load of guff, but very dangerous guff, from chips in your arm and chips in your head to what to do about the next 6-year lockdown that's coming around the corner. Luke, let's just change direction and tack a little. You have said to me previously that in relation to the Orthodox Conservatives, people are beginning to understand that that means social conservatism. What does social conservatism, without getting too deep, ideologically, what does that mean for you? Is it a bit like scripture? Is it as prescriptive as that, or is it more this is what underpins my and our beliefs, and this is what that means?
Okay, yeah, indeed. Just actually, to be a little bit cheeky, just to come back to one of the things that you said earlier, just because I think it's important, because you mentioned that link to Marxism. Some people, again, coming from a historical perspective, think that the fall of the Berlin Wall, all sort of stuff, that Marxism is dead and gone, isn't an issue anymore.
Oh, from it.
But indeed. And so what we see is that we do see these aspects of Marxism within the cultural, social sphere, in the economic sphere, and globalism. I mean, it's that old thing that, with the communists, that there would be no borders, because we'd all live in this kind of, global utopia, where it's this global, communist kind of world, and everyone owns nothing. So, I warn listeners who perhaps don't have an acute reading of these things, as to be very, very careful as we come closer and closer to 2030, as we closer to the next decade, about these different things. But I could go on and on about that. But to come more to the point, what is social conservatism? Well, unlike Marxism, and unlike capitalism and other things, there isn't one seminal text that you can read and digest and think, okay, I'm now a social conservative. Yes, there is Burke's writings, Edmund Burke. Yes, there are some other things from the French Revolution, and in response, or in reaction rather, to the social liberalism and to liberalism as a philosophy per se from the 19th century. For me, I think perhaps one of the easiest ways to look at social conservatism is to read the writings of Roger Scruton, who sadly died a couple of years ago, who is sorely missed. But so it's not limited by a Scrutonian idea of society and an idea of the way. He probably best articulates it as a contemporary philosopher and writer. But really, again, I mentioned those social institutions, so kind of a Durkheim functionalist idea of society, that institutions work well together. So part of our work recently in the Jubilee year is to make the intellectual case, I keep mentioning intellectual case, but to kind of give some grandstanding and to give some flesh rather to the idea of monarchy. Because we know that when Her Majesty the Queen sadly dies, and it's going to happen at some point, that the threat of republicanism, again, you mentioned earlier about whether the Conservative Party is unionist or not. I mean, even we're seeing, again, I read in Spectator today, that Sinn Féin are likely to become the leading parties both north and south of the border.
That's
Scottish,
nailed on.
The Scottish devolution is going to be a real problem, issue that will rear its head in the next 5 to 10 years. So again, from a philosophical understanding, there has to be questions and has to be answers that we have and have thought out. I don't mean, we're just coming up with random stuff in relation to current day politics, but from a philosophical, ideological perspective, there has to be answers to these questions. And all part of that forms what it means to be a social conservative. It values our tradition, it values the family, but also it values that what we have as a society, as I mentioned earlier, is fundamentally a good thing, and we want to hold on to that, but recognises then that we're not going to advance progressivism. So in some ways it could be, particularly I think for young people today who perhaps don't have a philosophical or a historical reading of society and its changes, social conservatism, in sort of common parlance rather, is a reaction against progressivism, whether that may be to do with trans issues, whether that might be to do with race or identity. And so Douglas Murray is perhaps probably the first person I can think of who would articulate that socially conservative reactionaryism, if that's even a word, against progressivism, which sounds a little bit kind of like I'm not defining my terms properly, but I think that's perhaps, without getting really dense about things, is perhaps the clearest way to articulate what we mean by social conservatism.
I think you've put the case strongly, and I think you've made it eminently understandable. I'll watch it back and make sure that what I think is true is true. But no, in all seriousness,
So.
I'm confident that anyone watching this will have understood. I mean, you name dropped two heavyweights there in Burke and Roger Scruton. My word, read their tomes, and you're well on the way.
But also, I suppose, to add to that, because what's really interesting is that there are a number of other people who aren't particularly on the right, per se. So I can think of Rod Little, who writes very good things for The Spectator. I'm not plugging for them, by the way.
No, I gather that's just 3 mentions so far.
So then, and then I also think of Melanie Phillips, then, who's also not particularly, who used to write for The Times. And actually her writings, I think she did a very good, I think perhaps for the Sun newspaper a couple of years ago, sort of documentary interview. And these are people who aren't necessarily right-wing, i.e. Conservative Party, but what they're saying about some of these contemporary issues, and again in reaction to progressivism, is what we, and I would certainly agree, is socially conservative. And that's how it proves that it's not a particularly, for want of a better expression, right-wing in the sense of party political issue. It sort of transcends those things. But then people will say, okay, well, why should we vote for the Conservative Party? That sort of contradicts the point that I was making earlier, that we should remain within the Conservative Party. Because also for me, I mean, there's that kind of, for those who know history again, Whigs versus Tories, that I kind of possess, and that kind of, suppose, from a moral, cultural, nay, religious aspect, is then that there's Toryism kind of triumphs over a slightly more Whiggish interpretation of conservatism, so that we value our cultural institution, we value perhaps the role of religion in society, not to say that we want to completely return back to a fundamentalist society, because actually we recognize that, yes, religion needs to have a greater role in society because it's important, and actually has had an important integral role in getting to where we are today. But we don't kind of want to return back to a fundamentalist where there is no kind of space and freedom for people who aren't convinced by our ideas. Now, I know some people may, perhaps if they are Christian, will fundamentally disagree with me and vigorously debate me on this issue, but you have to bring people with you. And trying to impose ideology, or trying to impose whether it's left or right on people, is not a view that I share, unfortunately.
No, I understand that. You've actually mentioned one institution and one body of people that I think are socially conservative. The Northern Ireland Unionists, I would say, are amongst the most loyal, the most socially conservative group probably anywhere in the United Kingdom. And I think they have been horrifically treated and let down by a government that very quickly forgot that without the confidence and supply motion, the Tories would not have been able to remain in power to give Boris his 80-seat majority. And the way in which the Northern Ireland Protocol has been applied effectively has annexed Northern Ireland and left that group, I would think, feeling pretty sore, because I agree with your earlier assessment. There is no question that Sinn Féin will win the largest number of seats and therefore will have the First Minister in Stormont. And having studied Irish politics in recent years and looked at the current composition of the Dáil, looking at opinion polling in the Republic, and also the mood on the ground in not just Dublin, but in some of the more, believe it or not, conservative areas of Ireland, there is no question that Sinn Féin in the Republic is surging. And I think the chances of a border poll in this decade now are very significant indeed. The second would be the Church of England, which used to be a wonderful, august organisation. But sadly, since the demise of Robert Runcie, we have been through an avowed Marxist in Rowan Williams. And what we have now in Justin Welby is not an Archbishop of Canterbury, but essentially a quasi-party politician. I thought
of the worst kind, too.
Oh, absolutely. His Easter address was absolutely appalling. And when you contrast that, and my wife happens to be Catholic, but I'm not of that inclination, but that's fine. But if you contrast that with the Pope's Easter speech, now, okay, there's an argument for saying that the Pope and the Catholic Church have had their own difficulties, and that's true. But the tone in which the Pope delivered his message, compared to the critique that came from Justin Welby, which I thought crossed the line personally, I thought was in stark contrast. So when you mention the role of religion, I think you're right. The country, and this is a bit like asking Jacob Rees-Mogg what he thinks about abortion. He's a Catholic, he's opposed to it, but he views it as a settled argument, and therefore it is what it is. The fact that we're killing 500 children a day, and yet we have a population of 1.61 children per woman, when for population replacement you need 2.1 children per woman. Guess what? It's only immigration that's really keeping the population.
I mean, there are so many interesting things. I'm interested in Northern Ireland, and I'll comment on that. Firstly, the other point is important too. But what's really interesting, having relation to that and having understanding of both North and South. So I know the northwest part of Ireland very well. It's actually has the largest community of Orangemen in the Republic, and voted the largest percentage against abortion in the referendum. So again, there's that relation to social conservatism, what that means, and then again, its relation to religion, which again is a very interesting question. But Sinn Féin in the Republic, people might not know in the mainland, that Sinn Féin in the Republic largely is a reaction against the old liberal establishment, which has failed Ireland massively in Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. And there's those related from the 2008 bust, and that kind of, we're just going to keep the party going and keep doing as we're doing. So a lot of younger people are sadly voting for this kind of almost slightly populist, left-wing populist kind of, think Corbynista type party,
Correct.
Because there is no other alternative. But also Ireland, and again, I suppose to give it, I would just mention too, that when an institution pulls out of anywhere, there's always a bit of a vacuum. So we see in the British Empire, when the Empire left India, there was a huge vacuum when it left South Africa, when it left other countries. There's always this vacuum, and what fills that vacuum? And in the case of Ireland, when the Catholic Church left and its integral place in that country, liberalism just ushered in, absolutely flooded in, economically, socially, and now we have a situation that is so far up the EU's backside, and is so kind of not wanting to deviate from the liberal orthodoxy that is incredibly narrow anyway of the European Union and all of that kind of thing, that one could almost argue it's almost impossible to be remotely socially conservative in the Republic. So that kind of gives the context to why Sinn Féin, I think, are so successful. But then in the north of Ireland, I think people are so despondent about how about how the DUP have been treated and how they are managing with how the Conservative government has treated the DUP, that again, it's almost a little bit like a protest vote, and it's a little bit like, let's just try and do something different. And again, kind of how they're cooperating, it's not in the same popular sense as how they are in the Republic, but it's to try and be other and be different. So neither of those situations really, and again, if you look at what implications that would have for the Union, are particularly positive.
Well, the
Conservative Party...
You'll know this, Luke. The DUP are in danger of not even finishing as the second largest party in the north. The Alliance and the DUP are pretty much running neck and neck. Precisely. And so that has, quite dangerous implications for those who are interested in the Union. Yeah.
More so because, I don't want to get into the argument of whether Ireland should be reunited or not. But you can say, okay, well, if it is, just to speak theoretically and to engage in the idea that it is, what kind of country would it be? Would it be a country that would have pluralism in the sense of where you could have Protestants and Catholics living together, if you want to look at it from an ideological perspective? Or would it just be an absolute liberal hellhole And for the minority of people then living in the north, let's say the Unionists, who have some semblance of conservatism, I mean, what kind of country would that be? Would I support that? I don't think I would, because you just have this huge disparity between people, at the complete end of the spectrum, who aren't interested in having a conversation, aren't interested in ideas. And I think that is something that the current Conservative Party is not interested in, or not even considering to any great extent at all. And so I suppose that's where, to some extent, as we as an organisation come in and say, hang on a minute, your party is not doing anything about that, is not looking at this idea at all. And that's where we can come in and lobby, we can come in and say, well, here is an alternative to this narrative. Actually, here is some narrative, here is some ideas to think about, talk about, discuss and disseminate.
Okay, and you wanted to also mention the Church of England.
Yes. Now, the Church of England, again, again, a complete opposite, I suppose, as an institution. I mean, we talk about institutions failing and the long march to the institution in the 1980s. Right. I mean, what's so interesting is that there is just this complete breakdown of orthodoxy, this complete breakdown of there being one thing that we subscribe to because it's what we believe. And again, I suppose, a symptom of postmodernism also, that anyone can have their own truth. I can have my truth and believe X, you can have your truth and believe Y. And so it's what Pope Benedict said, is that it's the, that relativity, that I forget his exact phraseology now, the way that he phrased it, but really it's this idea that we can believe anything that we want and then can just embrace the popular zeitgeist completely, and then feel that we have some kind of moral authority to then impose that on other people. Well, I'm sorry, but that's complete another claptrap. So,
well, you're being polite with claptrap. Thanks for keeping it clean. It's a family show. I mean, look, this whole notion of my truth, my lived experience, it's the word "my" I have a problem with, right? Yeah, truth is not personal. Truth is truth. Fact is fact. And this whole kind of this is what it is for me. Well, no, you're not going to tell me that ball on that table is anything other than green, because I can see it's green. I can hold it in my hand. It's green. And if you're going to tell me it's red, I'm going to call you a liar. No,
but also what's really interesting is that you have people who are committed to spreading the gospel, who are committed, they have a religious vocation, that they have something. Yeah. But again, they manipulate scripture, they manipulate the idea of who, people say that the person of Jesus Christ is, who is said that he is himself, to turn it into something overtly political. There's nothing, yes, there are things that are radical about the idea of the gospel, that are radical about Christianity, and that's that. And again, history tells you that there is a place for radicalism. Yes. But you then can't invert, and you can't subjugate something to tell a very specific political message that is not there. And that's something that is happening at the moment. I mean, I don't think it's primarily just limited to the Church of England. There are some on the other side of the aisle, as it were, in the Roman Catholic Church, that try and do the same thing, but it's most pronounced within the Church of England. I mean, I can't confess to have read his Easter message, because I know that it would upset me so much. And I know that I'd be so repulsed by this message. But when we have the idea that we have to kind of take the knee. I mean, do you remember when all that sort of genuflecting to this to this kind of golden calf of virtue signalling kind of wokery, postmodernist rubbish? I mean, that to come from our religious leaders, I'm sorry, people who have relatively pronounced role in public life, is mad. I mean, to think that we've allowed this to happen and we've given people this kind of agency, is mad.
Well, have we given it? Have they taken it? But the point is here, it's not that often these days that I would agree with Dominic Raab. But to use his words, I kneel for only two people: my wife and the Queen. Yeah. And I'm afraid that's my choice, and no amount of virtue signalling or Twitter pylons is going to change that position. I can tell you for sure.
Oh, well, I'm very glad to hear that.
I think just in closing, I'm mindful, and thank you so much for giving up so much of your time so freely. And inevitably, there's going to be a need to do this again, which is great. I'm sure viewers and listeners will appreciate that. just give me, in a relatively short order, it doesn't have to be exactly 150 words or even 140 characters, but just give me in reasonably short order why the Orthodox Conservatives and why people should look to get involved and subscribe and read the material that's there in front of them.
So the Orthodox Conservatives really is the only socially conservative group that's primarily for young people, that the next generation. So if you are a young person listening, or you know young people who are listening to this conversation with Chris and I, and want to get involved to make the case for social conservatism as a sensible choice for ordinary people, because we recognise that there are ordinary people out there who have deep within them a conservative instinct, who agree with much of what Chris and I have discussed today. And then we are the only vehicle to garner these people together, to connect them together. We have a campus network for those who are at university. We have a constituency network for a wider group of people who want to lobby their member of parliament. Your MP has to respond to you if you contact them. If enough people do that, then we can begin to have to engender an idea of who is friendly to the social conservative cause, and that really helps us then lobby parliamentarians at a parliamentary level. And hopefully by this way, we can affect some change. It's not going to happen overnight. We're not going to have huge wins, every other week, but it's how we can begin to affect real change. We recognise that social conservatism is something that needs to be propagated, something that needs to be given intellectual weight to. If you want to get involved, our website is available on the internet. There's this conversation, there's our Twitter page also. So please just get involved if you think it's something that you find interesting and want to help us again to make that case as a really, and quite simply, as a sensible choice for ordinary people.
Well, as someone who's a little bit older than young, I'm delighted to be able to play a small part in the group in terms of, as you say, certainly from an economic perspective as much as anything else. But I would urge people to have a look at the content. By all means, make contact via social media or however you wish to, through me if you want to, and I will be happy to be the conduit for that. But Luke, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chris,
for giving your time so freely on an afternoon where I know you probably could have spent the last 40 odd minutes with your head in a book and making sure that you get over the finish line, the checkered flag for your studies. So thank you so much. That was Luke Doherty from the Orthodox Conservatives.